Welcome, my name is Brett Malley. I'm a Kelby 1 instructor, and today I'm going to be talking about unlocking the power of curves. It is so important to understand how curves works and then to utilize it to maximize whatever imagery you're working with. So we're going to jump right in here and we're going to look at some examples and break down the very first introduction of working with curves specifically, which is the histogram, and understanding how it works and input and output. Because this can be, when you're first looking at it and you're new to the histogram, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So we're going to break it down and make it very easy to understand in all the bits, and then also have some fun with it. So looking at these images here, we have some options, and we're just going to look at the histograms of each of these. So I'm going to bring this one into Photoshop by double-clicking it in Bridge. And when you're doing curves, whenever possible, work non-destructively. Unless you very intentionally know that you don't need a bunch of layers and you're just doing something specifically, it's always a good idea to work in layers, and that's the most non-destructive way you can do it whenever possible. But each person has their own workflow, so find yours for the right results that you're getting. So working non-destructively, I'm going to go over to this curves adjustment here. So there's this icon where we add all these different adjustments. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is this one for curves. And that will add this new adjustment layer here. And what's, again, great about working in layers is I can always delete it. I can always change its opacity, completely non-destructive. So no matter what, even if you tweak things out and it looks terrible, there's never any sort of destructive edit that's permanent. So anyways, work non-destructively, work with layers whenever you can. So here we have our new curves adjustment. So let's break down what we're seeing right here. So in curves, you can show a bunch of different display options. So if you don't have this data and if yours does not look like mine, take a look at this little hamburger menu over here where we can pull up curves display options. So again, this little tiny menu here, and go to curve display options. This will allow you to make sure you can see the histogram, right? You can take off channel overlays, which we'll get to. So anyways, if you can't find something that you see here, that's your go-to place. I like this setup here with a basic kind of larger grid and where I can see my histogram, and we'll find out why in a second. So looking at this, what we see with this graph here is this is a graphical representation of all the darks and lights within our image, right? So everything from pitch black all the way to white. So if we made everything out of just black and white, let's think of it this way. Imagine that this image was made out of sand, piles of sand. You have a big pile of sort of black sand for all the darks, right? The quantity there. And with this sort of river going in here, this stream, a big pile of those lighter sort of colors as well, right? Those lighter pixels. So that's literally what we're seeing for the quantities here. So down at the bottom, we have our graph. This is the input. This is the graph of what it currently is. So we have this gradient from pure black all the way to white. And so when we talk about those piles of sand or piles of pixels, quantity of pixels, then we can see how much it stacks up. So there's a whole lot that is this sort of darker gray value, right? So it's right about here. And that's all these shadows of the nooks and crannies of the trees and the rocks and the moss. And then over here, we can see how much quantitatively there is of light pixels, right? And everything sort of in between. So we see this peak. That's right at the value of most of those lighter elements there. We can see we only have just a couple points that are barely touching pure white, which is a really good thing to have, and we'll again talk about that in a little bit. So this histogram is again just a graphical representation of the lights and darks within this image, the quantities of light pixels, midtones, and highlights within each image. So just to see some of the differences between the images, there's no one histogram that is going to be the exact same unless it's the exact same image, right? It's okay if they look differently. It depends on the image. So just because yours might look differently than mine, don't panic, right? Yours has different values, it has different content. So if the content changes, well then graphically it's going to be represented like that. So we can see there's a big spike of something really dark. That's probably the shadows down here, something in there in these dark spots. And then everything sort of falls a little in between with sort of spikes of contrast. And then finally some little mountain of highlights, which is probably just from this window area there. Looking at another example, going over, let's see, that one's kind of similar. Let's look at this one. New image here. And let's see, there's a person whose head's getting cut off there. Oops, let's see, I'm going to create a new curves adjustment for this. And so we can see this one fairly balanced. There's a bit of a spike for darks, right? That's probably just in the darkest shadows. Things are fairly split across the whole spectrum. And then finally, just some whites, some highlights that are getting right up to the edge there for being blown, but that sort of adds to the glare. As just a prelude to what you can do with curves, and we'll get into how this works in a little bit, but just to show, curves will control the dynamics, meaning the lights and darks of your image, and we'll go when you hit a control point and you go up, it's going to make it lighter, and when you go down, it's going to make it darker. So we'll get into how to finesse that and how that works, but anytime you really want to finesse any of the values, any of the lights or darks within your image, curves is a great way to go because you can articulate every single part of your image, and there's some really cool tricks you can do with it. So that's the idea of the histogram. This is just a graphical representation of all the lights and darks in the image. And once you understand that, then we can start pushing it and manipulating it to get us very different results and completely control the dynamics within our image. All right, so let's jump into that part.